So welcome. Yeah, this is our first session of Bible 101. I'm excited to be doing this. As we Margaret and I were talking, and some of this came out of some conversations with the Adult Education Council. Obviously, we talk about the Bible a lot in church settings. If you're a Sunday morning regular or semi-regular, Margaret and I do a lot of teaching out of the Bible, and sometimes the assumption is people know where to find things, and we recognize that there's a lot of questions people have, and the Bible is a strange book. So the purpose of this is just mostly to create space where I can teach a little bit about why the Bible is how it is, and people can ask questions, and really all questions are allowed, as long as they're related to the Bible, at least. I might not know the answer to questions, but I can try to look them up and get back to you. Some questions I might want to answer at a later time if they're complicated or take us off track. So I'm going to get started. I'll jump right in. I'm going to tell a quick story. I told this, I think, a year ago on a Sunday morning at Westminster, but I was I was raised in a family that did not go to church very often. I went to spent a couple of years in junior high at a church-related parochial school, and somebody somewhere at a concert had handed me a Bible, like a Gideon's Bible, a little pocket-sized New Testament in the King James version. I didn't know what to do with it. I figured I probably shouldn't throw it away. So I just kept it in my room. And then in my high school years, started going to church, got involved with a high school youth group, and somebody told me if I wanted to understand Christianity better, I should read Paul's letter to the Romans. And so I found this Gideon's Bible. I opened it up. It was the King James version, and I started reading, and I got to about chapter 3 or 4, and I just realized I had no idea what was going on. I had no idea what it was talking about, no idea how it mattered for me, and just was entirely lost. And I thought, I'm not a stupid person. I read literature. I should be able to understand this, and realized then that the Bible is a very strange book, comes from very different cultures, and it doesn't always make itself easy to read for us. And so that's a normal experience, I think. And so one goal of this class is to help make the Bible a little more approachable and maybe a little bit easier to read. Like I said, it's a strange book, but when we poke around, it's actually pretty ordinary. It's made up of writings that back in the day, back when it was first written, not all of them would have appeared strange to other people. Some of it's history, some of it's poetry, some of it is just letter writing, some of it is biography. But it's been used in a lot of ways. And when we encounter something that says, Holy Bible, it has kind of a feel to it, right? Or we see huge ones in churches, and we wonder what we're supposed to do with this book that makes it different from other books. That's what this 4-week series is about. I'm going to share my screen here from time to time tonight, just to make it a little more visual, more exciting than just looking at me. But I just want to give you the schedule of the sessions. What are we going to do for the 4 weeks that I'll be doing this? And tonight, what I want to do is talk about the arrangement of the Bible, how it's put together. Next Monday, I want to talk about the history of the Bible. Where did these writings come from? What kind of history are we supposed to know or should we know to help us make sense of the Bible? 2 weeks from tonight, the interpretation of the Bible. How do we make sense of it? What do we do when we're stuck or when things seem strange or difficult to understand? And then on the last Monday of October, getting better at reading the Bible. How can we, what are some practical strategies for making sense of it? What kind of helps are available to us out there? So that's what we're going to do. It's a powerful book, obviously. This is a book that has influenced Western society, probably like nothing else. This is a book that is at the center of so much of the church's life. This is the center of how we talk about our faith, or at least one of the centers of how we talk about our faith. People who translate the Bible, or who preach on the Bible, or who teach on the Bible, sometimes have an incredible amount of power over people's lives and people's understandings of God. And so it's worth our time to dig into the book and to try to get a better sense of where it comes from. To demystify it, not in the sense of making it plain or obvious or unable to speak to us, but in a way where we understand better of where it came from and we know whose fingerprints are on it and how it gets presented and why it gets presented in certain ways and in certain settings. At its basis, the Bible is a library. It's a collection of a number of different books. For most Christian traditions, that's 66 different books are in the Bible, all put together, right? All sewn together. And the like most libraries as well, it has the influence of librarians or of different curators, right, who have worked with this book. And so it's important to be aware of that, that when we open up a book, it says the Bible, we're reading things that come from a number of places. So I'll go back to sharing my screen here and to explain that in a little bit more detail. Um, oh, first there's this. Somebody showed me this the other day. Speaking of the Bible, this is a product you can buy for $40 called My Mood Bible. And it's like just a little speaker, and you press your mood. You can be happy or Thanksgiving or thankful or angry or sad, and it will play you it'll play you a verse to match your mood. So how about that? Bibles are packaged in a variety of different ways, and why that costs $40, I don't really know. But anyway, let's talk about other Bibles. So, um, whose work is in this? When I hold up a Bible, what are we talking about? It's important to know the Bible is the product of authors. In other words, there were real flesh and blood people living thousands and thousands of years ago who wrote the documents that found their way into the Bible. But they're not alone, right? It's not just them. They're also copyists, right? We don't have any original copies of biblical books. Like we can't go back to the original version of Paul's letter to the Romans or the Gospel of Matthew. What we have are copies of copies of copies. And so when things get copied, sometimes little changes are made here and there. But if it weren't for the copyists, right, we probably wouldn't have the books in our modern Bibles. There are editors who have been at work at this. Why do you need editors? Well, if we were to get all of the ancient papers, all the ancient manuscripts that exist, and line them all up, we would see that some of them are incomplete. Some of them only exist in a couple of pages. Some of them are the entire book. Some of them have little subtle changes here and there. And so editors are the ones who put these ancient texts together. So here's my Greek New Testament. This is the New Testament writings in Greek. I'll get this a little closer here. You can see you've got the Greek text in the main part of it. And then down here, you've got footnotes. These footnotes are all from editors. And what they are places where the editors say there's some differences. Some of the ancient texts we have say this, some say some other things. So this is where the editors are showing their work, saying, what we have here is a collection, right, from what's available. This is generally considered to be kind of the standard text of the Greek New Testament. So when people translate the Bible into English or any other language, for the most part, they're working from this text. Wouldn't you know it? There's one for the Old Testament as well. So here's my Old Testament, a lot bigger. It's a bigger book, written in Hebrew. Get your main text, and then what's down here, once again, the work of editors, right? People who are making comments about a variety of things. Why do you need editors? Good question. Because all the original Hebrew texts were written without vowels. Imagine a page or a book of English writing with only consonants and no vowels. You could put it together. It would take a little time. You could put it together. You could figure it out. You would occasionally not be sure about what certain words mean, and you might have disagreements with other people about what they mean. but editors have placed vowels in there based on how they think it originally was read, how it originally was vocalized. Similarly, with the Greek, in the Greek New Testament, original Greek writings had vowels, but they didn't have punctuation. They didn't have capitalization. They didn't have things like commas. And so it's not exactly clear sometimes where certain sentences begin and where certain sentences end. And so you have editors, you have experts in these languages who have tried to make the text a little more readable. Translators, thank God we have translators. Otherwise, we'd all have to learn Hebrew or Greek to read the Bible. The Bible's been translated into other languages almost as long as there's been a Bible. And even today is constantly being translated into more languages. There are a number of English translations and more every year. There are organizers. There's people who organize the Bible in a way to make it more understandable or easier to navigate. For example, chapters and verses. I'll talk about those more in just a moment. There are also more editors who come along to try to help make the Bible easier to understand. And then finally, there are people who contribute various kinds of helps. What do I mean by all of this? Let me put up a page from a Bible. Anyway, there's a number of Bibles you can find, online. So here's a photo I took earlier today of the 24th chapter of Luke's Gospel out of one of my Bibles. So just to look at this page and to think about it for a minute, right? On the one hand, this looks like any other book. It's got page numbers, right? It's got writing on the front and on the back. It's in two columns. What here comes from an actual author? Well, this text does. Hopefully you can follow my pointer here, right? Beginning after where it says this large number 24, you've got all of these sentences, which are, of course, in English. They've been translated into English by a team of translators. More on that in just a minute. But you've got more here, don't you? You've got footnotes down here on the bottom right. Again, hopefully you can see my arrow here. You see in very, very small print the letter A, and it says GK was dawning. And you have to figure out what in the world is that from? Well, because there's a letter A up here, end of chapter 23, verse 54. And it says, and the Sabbath was beginning. And here it says, an actual more literal translation was dawning. So you got all these little notes here that offer different possible translations or things that say like other ancient authorities add. In other words, other ancient texts might disagree. So here's a place where the translation team said, we really ought to show people where we had disagreements, where we weren't exactly sure how to phrase it. So that's the work of translators there. You've got the work of organizers here, where it says the resurrection of Jesus at the start of chapter 24, right here on the top right of the page where it says the walk to Emmaus. Those are not part of the original Bible. Those are section headings that have been added by modern editors. Why did they add them? To make the book easier to sort through, right? To help you find your way. But the original Greek authors did not have headings. They did not have chapters and verses. The chapters were added to the Bible in the 13th century. So for a long time, for over 1,000 years, the church read its scriptures just kind of beginning to end with no real way of saying, well, where did you get that from? Or where are you quoting from? Somebody divided the Bible up into chapters in the 12th century, and then that wasn't enough. And so then later on in the 16th century, somebody divided the chapters up into verses. And that's where all the numbers come from. So the numbers are, again, a modern help, right? A way to help you navigate the Bible. So if I were to say, let's all turn to Luke chapter 24, it would be more or less easier for us to find it as opposed to if I just said, get to the Gospel of Luke and, get close to the end and find the paragraph that begins with the word but. So the chapters and verses have stuck. They've stuck around. They're used all over the world in various kinds of Bibles. But again, that's the later work. That's an organizer who has come along and said, wouldn't it be easier if we could find our way around? I mentioned other helps also down at the very bottom here. So this comes from a study Bible. Um, so this is a Bible that deliberately devotes about a quarter of each page to additional notes. These notes come from modern scholars or modern teachers who are trying to provide a little bit more information about what you're reading. You might find the word denarius somewhere. The denarius was a coin that was used during the Roman Empire. Nobody knows what a denarius is worth, or at least most people don't know. I do. A denarius was essentially a daily wage for a manual laborer. So that kind of helps us get a sense of what it was worth. But the biblical authors don't stop and they don't slow down and assume that you know what a denarius is or what a cubit is, which is a unit of length in the Old Testament. And so every now and then, you will find in these footnotes information from a modern author. So here on this single page, right, what's the Bible? Technically, it's only the words up here. And then what's been added? Well, you've got, again, section headings, translator footnotes, and then helps from other people. Some Bibles include things like maps. Some Bibles include things like charts. Some Bibles include introductions to every book of the Bible. It's a variety of different things you can find in different study Bibles. One thing that's worth noting here, and I'll take a pause in just a minute. One thing that's worth noting here is there are a number of different English translations of the Bible. Perhaps you know that. The English translations are all copyrighted. In other words, these are owned by different publishing houses or something like the World Council of Churches or the National Council of Churches, different organizations, sometimes commission translations, and then become the holders of those copyrights. That means that anytime you buy, for example, the King James Version, no matter who the publisher is, you should be getting the exact same English translation, no matter what. Here's another Bible. Here's a study Bible I sometimes use. So you can see at the very top here, New Revised Standard Version, Updated Edition. That's the name of the English translation. It was done by a team of scholars, and it's copyrighted, right? So that means anybody who wants to publish a New Revised Standard Version, Updated Edition Bible with their own maps or their own notes or whatever has to pay to use that particular text. So to go back to this screen that I had up just a moment ago, anytime you buy a Bible or look at a Bible that says New Revised Standard Version, it's going to have this text. Nobody's going to change it. In fact, the section headings as well are part of that copyrighted text. So also are the translator notes. They're part of that copyrighted text. What can change from Bible to Bible are all of these footnotes down here. So you might go to the store, you might go to Amazon, and you might find something called like the Men's Study Bible or the Women's Study Bible or the Teen Study Bible or who knows, right? The Bricklayer's Study Bible, who knows? These are Bibles written by or produced, right, by publishers. And what they do is they take an English translation and then they add their own notes to it, right? They add notes that they think are going to be relevant to their audience. So if it was a teen Bible, it might have teachings or insights that they think are going to be helpful to teenagers or whatever. Do you see what I mean? It's the way in which the Bible is packaged, so to speak. The Bible itself or the English translation itself doesn't change. What changes is how it's been produced. There are a ton, well, not a ton, there are scores, dozens of different English translations available out there. You might have heard of the King James Version. This is a particularly old one, over 500 years old. That was revised to the New King James Version that got rid of some of the these and the thous that are in it. Another popular one is the New International Version. The one you'll find in the pews at Westminster is the New Revised Standard Version. That one was recently revised again to the New Revised Standard Version, updated edition. It's getting a little bit ridiculous these days. This Bible is an updated edition, so it's an update of a revision, right? Of a revision, because it's the new revised one. In other words, there was the King James Version for a very long time. In the 1940s, a group of American scholars produced the Revised Standard Version. What's the standard version? For them, it was the King James Version. So the RSV, or this Revised Standard Version, was a revision of the King James. Then in the 1980s, late 1980s, it was revised again, and they named it the New Revised Standard Version. And now just either last year or I think it was in 2023, this updated edition came out. So there's just a lot, right? Why update translations? Well, language changes and insights change, and frankly, publishers need money. So nothing sells like a new Bible translation sometimes. Um, anyway, that's just to say this is who's on the page when you open a Bible, and that's true for something like a study Bible, which is what I oops, that's the wrong thing to share. That's my wrong window. Um, sorry about that. That's true if you're looking at a study Bible. Or here, this is my King James version. And this is pretty much a no-nonsense Bible, right? There are no footnotes at the bottom of any of these pages. But notice it still has what? Up here, Jesus is crucified, the empty tomb. It still has headings at the top. It still has chapter and verse divisions. And it's also got here in the center column places where you might say, or you might, it's directing you. You can find similar stories in other places in the New Testament. You've also got this red text because for some reason the editor said, what if we put all of the words that Jesus speaks into red ink as opposed to black ink just to make it more special? Some Bibles do that. Who decides that? Again, modern editors. That's not part of the original Bible. So we see things like this in a number of Bibles. All Bibles have been made a little bit more user-friendly. At least that's the goal. Whether or not they succeed is another question. Here's a table of contents from one of my Bibles. Bibles have really thin pages, so sorry that everything you can read the page on the other printing on the other side of the page. But you'll notice, look at all of this. Right? At the very beginning, names and order of the books, alphabetical list of books, right? A new table of contents. Editorial board, who were the people who made the editorial decisions? Contributors, who wrote all of the notes and all of the introductions? Here's a main introduction. Here's something called To the Reader. That's part of the New Revised Standard Version. Abbreviations, list of illustrations, maps, and tables, right? All of these things have been added by modern scholars, modern teachers, to provide a little more background and a little more help. When you actually get to the Bible, here on page 1, the Hebrew Scriptures or the Old Testament, you've already had, what, over 62 pages of introduction here. Then you've got some other books. Then you've got the New Testament. I love this. It jumps from page 1 to page 1289, and then page 1651. And at the very, very end, index to color maps. And then you've got maps at the very end. So it can be a little overwhelming. And that's just worth noting that a lot of these modern Bibles have added a ton of material to try to help you stay a little more, I don't know, engaged, a little more informed about what you're reading. I'm going to come up for breath here and look at the chat quickly and kind of see what I have to say. How do churches decide which Bible to use? That's a great question. That's a decision usually the leadership would make. I don't know the story behind that at Westminster, but it's probably it's by whoever is kind of running the church, so to speak, decides which translation to put like in Pew Bibles and which ones to read most most regularly. The um, some translations are more preferred in some churches compared to others. The because every translation has its own like guiding criteria. Some translations are done by an individual. One person translates it. Other translations are done by like a translation committee meant to kind of provide some checks and balances. The New Revised Standard Version, for example, when that was created, it was a deliberately diverse team. So you had Protestants working on it, you had Roman Catholics working on it, you had Eastern Orthodox Christians working on it. The Old Testament also involved Jewish scholars translating with the translation of the Hebrew. So it was deliberately trying to be kind of a Bible for the whole church worldwide. Other translations are a little more narrow. If you read the introduction to the New International Version, it says something like all of the translators basically signed on to a statement confessing that the Bible was like the inspired word of God. In other words, they had kind of a theological litmus test for for those translators. Some translations say we're only going to use words that fit like a seventh grade reading level or lower to make it more accessible, right? To avoid archaic language or things like that. So those are some of the differences in translations. Usually it's kind of up to pastors of the church leadership who would decide. I'm trying to look something up here while I'm teaching, and it's not going well for me. But I was also asked, who owns the copyright to the NRSV? Good question. I think that was originally held by the National Council of Churches in the United States, and then they sold the copyright to HarperCollins, and HarperCollins recently sold it to a company called Friendship Press. So, yeah, always a good question. The New International Version, I believe the copyright for that is owned by the National Association of Evangelicals. Some of them are held by publishing houses, so it just kind of depends who owns it. Ken, do we lose anything by not reading the Bible from start to end? I typically jump around. I'm going to come back to that in weeks ahead when I talk about how to read the Bible well. I think jumping around is usually a really good idea, personally, is my short answer to that. Um, uh, and yes, the Bible is a collection of books for sure. Have I lost anybody at this point? Just kind of talking about, when we pick up the Bible, what are we talking about? There's a lot of people's hands that this has been through. Not that that's a bad thing. It's just worth knowing. That's one of the reasons why it's such a cluttered book from time to time. Have I lost anybody? If you don't know me, I'm pretty hard to offend, or so really any question is fair game for me. Don't have to worry about that. All right, you're all pretty agreeable, I think. We should point out, oh, here's something. Which translation of the Old Testament is more close, I'm assuming, to the Hebrew? Um, that's a great question. Um, I personally am a fan of the New Revised Standard Version. I'll explain why in a minute. That's the one that recently was updated to the updated edition. They've actually phased out the New Revised Standard Version. I think it's actually being kind of taken off the market so as to drive more traffic to the updated edition. Once again, great way for religious publishers to make money is to commission a new Bible translation. So be a little skeptical about every new one that comes along. The New Revised Standard Version is like I said, it still is an updating or revision of the King James Version. So sometimes you will see turns of phrases in there that still evoke memories of the King James Version, which was great for its day, but we don't speak like that anymore. The New Revised Standard Version translators also say that their strategy was, trying to remember the exact wording here, as literal as necessary and as free as possible. In other words, they're trying to be really close to kind of a word by word translation, but they want to be free in their translating so that it flows, right? So that there's a kind of energy and beauty to the language. If anybody speaks more than one language, or you've ever translated things for a living, you know, right? There can be a very wooden translation or a translation that doesn't really sound like how people talk. Some translations flow a lot more. It's never exciting reading, but if you ever want to read the introduction to any Bible translation, you can sometimes learn quite a bit about how they translated and why. Sometimes it's called To the Reader or some kind of a reader's introduction. And there, they'll sometimes talk about their translation strategies. So some translators will, there are different translation theories out there. Again, this is true whether you're translating, poetry from French to English, whether you're translating the Bible from an ancient language into a modern language. Sometimes you want the form to match. In other words, you want every Greek word, every Greek appearance of a single word to be translated into the same English word, right? You want readers to be able to know how it was, where a word might repeat or where a word might change to a synonym. Sometimes translators value what they call functional equivalence. In other words, how does it have the same effect? I mean, think about a poem, right? If you have a poem that rhymes beautifully in Spanish and you translate that to English, you have to figure out how do you make it rhyme beautifully in English, right? Or how do you create that same feel? So translation is always an act of interpretation, right? It always has the translator's own flourishes built into it. Maybe artificial intelligence will get better at translating where it can do things like poetry, but for the most part, AI, right? Or if you go to Google Translate, for example, for the most part, it's going to give you a very wooden kind of a lifeless translation. You put poetry in there, you put metaphor and, imaginative language, and it's going to come out pretty flat on the other side. So hopefully that's helpful to kind of get a sense for, what makes a translation good or useful. So when it comes to what's best to the Hebrew, with the original question, I was off on a long tangent there. I think the NRSV does a very good job of kind of being as precise as possible at the expense of sometimes there are places where the language is a little bit flat. There's also a translation put out by the Jewish Publication Society. It's called Tanakh, Tanakh. Put that in the chat, which is a very good translation. Right, this is done entirely by Jews of the Old Testament, which is again the same scripture we have. Somebody else asked, what about the Message? So the Message is produced by a single person, a man named Eugene Peterson, who is a Presbyterian pastor. I think he was chaplain of the Senate for a long time. And he produced, technically not a translation, he called it a paraphrase, which is what we would call kind of a light translation, right? Not so concerned about a word by word translation and rather trying to kind of capture the spirit of a text. The Message is not a great technical translation, and Peterson admits that as much in his introduction. But it's a nice way to kind of bring the Bible alive, right? Because all of a sudden you hear maybe familiar passages now voiced in a new way, right? Trying to speak in a more modern, um, in a more modern tone, right? With kind of more modern turns of phrase or even slang from time to time. The flip side of that is it's easy for a Bible like that to sound out of date in a hurry. when my young adult children are around and I use slang from 10 years ago, they quickly tell me not to say that ever again. Um, right, because language comes and goes. Um, Dead Sea Scrolls, that's in the chat as well. Those are different books. Those are Jewish writings. For the most part, those are Jewish writings produced by Jews in the first century. However, the Dead Sea Scrolls, or what was found in those caves by the Dead Sea, did include biblical texts, and those were not originally from the authors, but those were copies, Hebrew copies of biblical texts. Um, some of those are copies. A few of the Dead Sea Scrolls actually appear to be original manuscripts written by authors. Um, Another question. Real Durant connects various stories in the Bible to other, even older cultures. Is there any respected book that addresses these historical similarities? Um, yes. There's a lot of them. I mean, so not so much a Bible version. Sometimes you will see in, the footnotes of a good study Bible, places where we see similarities to other ancient literature, but some of that is more like in the work of scholars writing around the Bible. Last one on the chat. Why weren't some of the original New Testament texts in Latin or Hebrew? Are we sure? Did everyone in the Mediterranean world use Greek this much, or was it only the language of the educated class of the Eastern Mediterranean? That's a good question. For the most part, yes, Greek was the common tongue in the Roman Empire during the first century. That doesn't mean that that's the only thing everybody spoke. We're pretty sure Jesus, for example, spoke Aramaic, which is similar to Hebrew. It's another Semitic language that's very similar to Hebrew. Um, but at the same time, we see the archaeology shows us Greek inscriptions, things where people, either texts or places where people wrote on walls, all throughout the places where Jesus lived and in nearby cities. In the first century, Latin is being spoken in Rome, in places in what's now Italy, and in some kind of colonial outposts that Rome had established. But for the most part, if you wanted somebody to read what you were writing, you would write it in Greek. So the New Testament writings, as best we can tell, as best we can look back, are all written in Greek. There are some debates about whether or not part of the Gospel of Matthew might have been originally written in a different language, like Aramaic. Those hypotheses have a little trouble. Um, so at the same time, if Jesus speaks in Aramaic to his followers, and his followers remember what he said, and then later on the Gospels get written in Greek, somebody's already done some translating, right? Somebody has already taken the words of Jesus from Aramaic and now translated them into Greek, for example. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but it's just another way in which, right, we've got a lot of people's hands on the words in our Bibles. I'm going to press on, if that's all right. Hopefully this is, I can't see all of your faces at once. I'm going to assume you're all having a great time. Let me go back to sharing my screen here. And I want to talk about the arrangement of the books. And this is often one of the more confusing things when it comes to the Bible. You might be in a Bible study, or maybe you're at Westminster in the recreation room on a Sunday morning, and Margaret says, open to the book of Second Corinthians, and you're like, oh dear, where am I going to find this? And we all like go like this, and we look at the very top line, and we try to find it and hope we know where it is and hope it shows up, or you can go to the table of contents. Uh, there's no easy way to do this beyond memorizing it or just sticking a post-it on your table of contents and going to your table of contents whenever you need it. Some Bibles list their table of contents like this one that I took a photo of earlier today. And this is in sequence, right? So This goes through in page number. Sometimes you can find a table of contents where the books are all in alphabetical order. So we'll start, for example, with the book of Acts, and then maybe move on to, I don't know, Corinthians, First and Second Corinthians, and then eventually, you get toward the end, which will help you find pages. I'm starting with the New Testament here because it's smaller and it might be more familiar to you. If you look at this table of contents, it comes out of a study Bible. And lo and behold, here at the very beginning, Introduction to the New Testament. And you've got all of these things in italics. This is not part of the Bible. These are things that scholars wrote, right? These are ways of helping you make sense of it. And now here you've got Matthew. Ta-da, the Gospel of Matthew. And now you've got, again, passages unique to the Gospel of Matthew. This is not part of the Bible, right? A modern scholar wrote that. Mark, part of the Bible, modern scholar, and then John, Acts, and so on. Down here where it says essays, these are not part of the Bible, right? These are things written by modern scholars. Some of you, if you've been coming to Westminster Sunday mornings in the last 2 years, we had Emerson Powery on, we had Brent Strawn on. Yeah, I know some of these people. Some of them are good people. Anyway, so the New Testament, our Bible is split. The Christian Bible, for most Christians, to simplify things, is split into two parts, the Old Testament and the New Testament. Sometimes we'll call those the Older Testament and the Newer Testament. Same thing. Why the difference in language? Sometimes we worry that calling the Older Testament old sounds like it's devalued or less important or overshadowed or obsolete, which is not what that word Old Testament or that expression Old Testament means to imply. It's just older than the Newer Testament. It comes from the time prior to Jesus. New Testament doesn't mean necessarily better or somehow, the final version or something like that. It just means newer, so older and newer. Both testaments are arranged in a way that tries to tell a story. It tries to kind of walk you through a story. So the New Testament begins, it's 27 books with Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. All four of these are gospels. That word gospel simply it's a form of a biography. These are biographies of Jesus that are attributed to four different people. More on that next week. But we've got now the story of Jesus told four different times from four different perspectives. That's followed by a book called Acts. The full title is The Acts of the Apostles. This is the story of Jesus's followers. I should say some of Jesus's followers in the years following his death, resurrection, and ascension. It's also a narrative, right? Storytelling. And then you've got from the book of Romans all the way over on this column to Philemon. You've got 13 books here that are all attributed to the Apostle Paul, somebody who was once a persecutor of the early church, the young church, and then became a convert, started following Jesus, and became a leader in the church. And he wrote a number of letters. We've got 13 that bear his name. They're organized essentially from the longest to the shortest. Not very creative. They're not in chronological order. They're not in order from best to worst. They're not in alphabetical order. They're just in order from longest to shortest. That's just the way they've been traditionally arranged. You've got a book called Hebrews, which is also kind of a letter, kind of a sermon. And then you've got some more letters, one from somebody named James, two that are attributed to Peter, three that are attributed to John. These are names of Jesus's followers, one attributed to Jude. So from Romans through Jude, you've got their, oh goodness, I have to do some math. You've got 21 books that are all more or less letters. Sometimes the fancy word for that is epistles. These are all describing time after Jesus was born. I'm sorry, after Jesus had departed this world, and are talking about the church trying to figure out what does following Jesus look like. The New Testament ends with a book called Revelation. There's a lot we can say about Revelation. I won't say too much, but it does purport to talk about future events. So the New Testament tells the story from Jesus. Matthew and Luke both begin with the birth of Jesus, all the way up to Revelation and the promise of God making all things new. So they try to again walk us through this story. I'll talk more about where these books came from and their arrangement next week. But just to notice that the Newer Testament is organized beginning with Jesus, centered around Jesus, and then ending with a vision of the future. The Older Testament, here's another photocopy or photo I took of one of my tables of contents. The Older Testament has 39 books. The Christian Old Testament, 39 books. Our Jewish friends and neighbors also read the exact same books as their Bible. They organize them in a different order. We can talk about that later if you want. It begins with Genesis. Genesis begins with in the beginning, tells the story of creation. In other words, it's organized with, the start of time, right? The God's creation of all things. The first 5 books tell the story of God choosing people through Abraham, God promising to bless the world. I'll unpack this more in days to come. Through the giving of the law. Then you've got books, Joshua through roughly through Second Chronicles. So Joshua through Second Chronicles. These are books that tell history. These tell the history of the settling of the Hebrew people in the land that we call Israel today, uh, um, and has had many names throughout time. We'll talk about that some if you're in Westminster on Sunday morning, where I'm teaching about that. And they end with in end of Second Kings, end of Second Chronicles. You've got the victory of the Babylonian Empire, who takes then people away into an exile. Ezra and Nehemiah talk about life after the exile. That's more history. Then you've got some other books here that are collections of folk tales, collections of songs, collections of wisdom sayings. That's roughly Esther through Song of Songs. Then from Isaiah all the way through Malachi, that's how many books? Is it 16, I believe? 17? You have the writings of prophets. These are people who, in one way or another, can claim to be speaking on behalf of God, claim to have seen visions, or claim to have been channeling messages that they received from God. The organization of these books is complicated because it doesn't follow, again, a chronological sequence. And so it's sometimes it's challenging to figure out who are these people and when are they writing. Because the time in which they wrote, Isaiah through Malachi, roughly corresponds with what we see in First and Second Kings and First and Second Chronicles. Some of it comes after that time, but for the most part, these are prophets who are working alongside of, I should say, existing alongside of various kings throughout the history of the nation of Israel and Judah. So the movement here is from creation to exile to life after exile. And then you've got these prophets who's are offering criticism, are sometimes offering warnings, but are also offering hope from time to time for the future of the nation. So it's not a history that moves in a linear way. The Older Testament isn't. It's kind of history. When the history is done, you get folklore and song and poetry, and then followed by these prophetic writings. So I'll talk about this more in the weeks to come about how you usefully can kind of jump around in this different kind of literature from book to book. But I just want to note the arrangement, right? The way in which this is arranged. All Christian Bibles arrange these 39 books in the same way, as far as I know, the vast majority, I should say. Again, Jewish scriptures have the ordering slightly differently. And that's a longer story than we probably have time for tonight. But in terms of arrangement, right? So then the question is, well, how do I read it? Do you have to start at the beginning and move forward? Some people try that. The joke is usually once people get to Leviticus, they give up because, Genesis has some colorful stories. Exodus has some exciting stories. Second half of Exodus is a lot of law, a lot of just recitation of laws that Moses receives from God. And then Leviticus is pretty much all law with a few stories woven in here and there. And it's, I'll just, I find it boring. And then Numbers, if you get to the book of Numbers, the fourth book, more and more law with a little bit of narrative in there. Um, a lot of genealogies, just lists of who was the father or the parent of so and so. It's not always the most exciting reading. So I'll talk in weeks ahead about effective ways to read through the Bible in ways that find it meaningful. But it's not the kind of book that really rewards picking it up at the very beginning and just saying start to finish. Sometimes people try to read through the Bible in a year. I'll talk about those in weeks to come. There are calendars that kind of tell you this day read these chapters, now read these chapters. That can be tough sledding if you don't know where you are in history and how to relate what you're reading to other parts of the Bible. Is that a problem? Maybe. But maybe part of learning to read the Bible well involves kind of knowing where to drop in from time to time, knowing where to look, right? Knowing how to read it and what to read first and what to read second and what to read third. There are no rules. You can read whatever part of it you want. But we'll talk about ways in which we might read it more smartly, more faithfully in the coming 3 weeks. A similar thing too, when it comes to something like translations, people sometimes ask me, what's the best Bible to buy? And it kind of depends what you're looking for. I mean, we talk about that, but usually, find a translation that works for you, that sounds right, that seems to come from a trustworthy source. Ask the pastor, ask me. I mean, we can give recommendations and things like that because there are a lot of them that are out there for sale. But just today's about the arrangement. And next week, we'll talk more about the history of these texts. All right, a couple questions in the chat here. One of them, have new Bible translations been the result of new source documents or an attempt to understand or interpret the source documents in light of our current cultural context? Really both. So one of the values of new translations, especially those that come, I'm going to show my bias here, from teams of scholars, is that they will take account of just things we discover. Sometimes new texts show up that help us say, oh, that's what that word means. I mean, there are parts, especially in the Old Testament, there are some parts where people aren't exactly sure what certain turns of phrase mean. We think we might know, but there's some ambiguity there. We're working with a very old language. And sometimes we learn more. Sometimes Bible translations come as a result because the scholarly consensus about how to understand something has changed a bit. Sometimes new translations are written again because language changes. So the NRSV was pretty groundbreaking in its day because it went out of its way to use more gender inclusive language. So when the term brothers was being used, when somebody was clearly addressing an audience of men and women, the NRSV translators would include and sisters, right? Just as a way of taking out some of the very male focus of scripture. The NRSV UE has made some changes. I think words like crippled don't appear anymore, for example. There's certain language we use to talk about like illnesses or disabilities that hasn't aged well. And so sometimes we make changes. There's some great old King James phrases that have had to be changed as well. When Paul talks about getting stoned, for example, that has to be changed to being attacked with rocks as opposed to Paul talking about getting stoned. So some of that's why it changes, right? Because language changes, English means different things. In Bible school, they taught us to start with the New Testament, then work backwards. I think that's a good strategy. I think starting with the Gospels is a really good place to begin. I'll talk some more about that. Oh, the Apocrypha. I was asked, can I speak about the Apocrypha? Maybe in coming weeks. I'll find somewhere on the Westminster website, I did do some teaching on the Apocrypha in the summer of 2024, and I'll try to find some of that. My husband and I owned a bookstore, and that was the hardest question when a customer asked us what Bible to buy. Exactly. I can only imagine that you get a lot of questions. The most recent thing I've read tells me that the King James Version is still the most sold version in the United States, like by far. Like it's almost half of the Bible sold, which is funny because it's so unreadable to a lot of modern people. But a lot of people kind of think, well, that's what the Bible is, right? It's archaic, formal language. So there's kind of a distrust of more recent translations because people like their these and their thous. Um, but it's funny, right? I mean, the goals of translation, hopefully, are how do we make this book more read? How do we make this book more understandable by more people? Um, and sometimes we sometimes the church, sometimes the world, sometimes the market maybe has the opposite effect because so many Bibles are out there today. And next week I will talk about the the question of the history. Where do these books come from? What are they talking about? Who wrote them? Those kinds of questions.